Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today's very interesting webinar. I think extremely timely in the discussion we're going to have. My name is Tyler Whale. I'll be your moderator today. It's a pleasure to share the screen, I suppose, with these four experts that we're talking with today. The method for today is that each panelist is going to have 5 minutes. We'll have a 15-minute panel session after their opening statements, followed by some Q&A. If the Q&A happens to go beyond 10 o'clock, we will stay on and answer questions for anyone who wants to have that discussion. I'm not sure to what extent the speakers can stay on, but I know that we have some time. All participants are on mute, so there are no voice questions. Just submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom. If perchance they aren't answered, we will make sure to answer those questions via email. I think it's important that you understand that this is not a webinar that is intended for marketing purposes. We will not contact you after this. Save to send the recording of the webinar. And any questions can go to john@shantala.org. That's SHANTALLA.org. If perchance we are Zoom bombed, we will end the session immediately, and a recording will be made available to you, and you can always connect again with John and the other panelists through that email that I've provided. So, initiating, I think, again, this is a really interesting and timely topic. And really today, the discussion, in only 1 hour, certainly we won't deal with it all, but it is about systems thinking and the consequences, really the cascading consequences of when there is system failure. So this is about preparedness and planning, both before, during, and after a crisis, and what stage we are now on, what opportunities we now have given the exposure to the fragile ecosystems that we have. Looking at the picture on this first slide, you can just get a sense of what that food system is all about. It's a system of systems, really, and each one of those circles, biological, economic, the farming, the political, the social, they're all very interrelated and very complex. And I would encourage you to take a screenshot of that picture and blow it up and really see it and think about it. So today we have four very interesting speakers. Initiating the panel is John Keogh, Carl CJ, as he likes to be called, Eunice, Karen Hand, Dr. Karen Hand, and Kevin Dean. I will first introduce John, and we'll go through the 5 minutes for each panelist. And John, he is a recognized global expert in supply chain integrity. And besides, or when he's not working with the Fortune 1000s of the world or senior VPs, he's a frequent speaker on how technology, industry standards, and regulations can be used to enhance supply chain transparency and consumer trust. And I'm very pleased to introduce John to the listeners. And John, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, Tyler, for that. I won't go on video to save bandwidth, but safe to say the conversation today is going to be hopefully very exciting, but we'll only touch on some small slivers. Now, straight away, I'm going to start with an eye chart for everybody. Because this is really what the food system looks like if we look at it from an ecosystem perspective. And over here on the left-hand side, one of the key things we want to do is we want to look at how do we build in resilience. And resilience is resistance to a shock that can happen. Now, when we think about a shock can happen at many different areas. It can enter the ecosystem from many levels. There is geopolitical strife, climate change, food security issues, energy issues, and of course with technology and science. But as we look at the roles and responsibilities within the ecosystem, we can see that the government plays a key role in the overall governance. So issues of policy, regulations, funding for innovation, also maintaining the health and safety of their citizens, but also to maintain the domestic and international trade enablement. Sometimes within countries, we have non-tariff trade barriers. And of course, food security becomes a key issue, and risk management and biosecurity. So not only that, the governments have a role to play in global citizenship and making sure that their borders are open for exports and also encouraging others to ensure that they can export products to the market. We have a critical dependency on a number of countries for large commodities for the food sector. Now, as we look at this, we look at technology, for example, and technology expands right through to the value chain. Today, we suffer within the food industry because we just don't have our systems connected. Now, if we look at the application of technologies, I won't mention any specific one, but if we look at technologies, there's many, many technologies out there, but they can provide us with early warning systems and alerts. They can help us with tracking and with prediction. They can help us create data dashboards and look at the total volume of foods being produced, and if something happens within that, if there's any risk. Hence, the data dashboards can also become the diagnostics and prognostics. Within the healthcare system, if we look at the health outcomes from food, they can help us with treatments and cures. And also on the social control. Now, when we start looking at technology for social control, which is very important, we push privacy up against the concerns of public health. But one of the big inhibitors of moving technology into solving some of these big, hairy problems is the fact that we have, on the one hand, we have too much data, but in essence, we actually have very little clean data, and this is a significant problem for the industry to look at. But if we get our technology right, it can provide us with early warning systems and circuit breakers to be able to stop something before it becomes a significant problem. If we look at the consumer side, so will the consumer habits change as a result of the current pandemic? Previously, consumers were focused on their favorite brand of product, and now it's any brand of product because of availability. So where will they buy? Will shoppers be comfortable buying online and having a proxy shopper walking through the store, buying the products or putting the products for them into a basket? And what is the impact on retail? So will retail get bigger? Will it get smaller? Will the aisles get bigger? What is the impact of that on the supply chain? Will packaging change? And if the e-commerce changes and grows significantly, what will that do to our delivery systems? For example, will we have more of the Ubers in the gig economy to deliver food? Will consumers return to restaurants, for example, in food service? Will they get bigger? Will they get smaller? Will restaurants start focusing more on delivery or developing what's called the ghost kitchens? So all of these things related to the consumer have a significant impact on the food ecosystem, and we need to look at that. Similarly, Karen will talk about this in more detail, but the complete farming ecosystem is massive. And we have to look at farming not only from just the crops that they're producing, but also everything that they need, from mechanics to service their equipment before they start planting and harvesting. They need veterinarians, they need seeds, they need staff, fertilizer, and so on. So quite a lot of needs in that ecosystem alone. But today what we have a lot of fires burning. Now, some of these fires are burning larger in some areas, but we need to be able to address those as we move forward. And what will happen is, if we address those properly and diligently, we can set the next stage of our food ecosystem for when we return to that new normal. Now I'll pass over to CJ.
Thank you, John. So cascading interdependencies are literally everywhere. If we look over to the left, with regard to the pandemic flu, there are a number of existential factors that can play into our global problem right now. And at the core of these, not only are the hazards that we are dealing with, but there are direct and indirect impacts for the things that are happening globally. At the underlying portion of all of this lies the infrastructures that literally support the enterprise systems that we are involved with every day. Over to the right, you can see all of the infrastructures that are currently being impacted and the secondary impacts to sociocultural systems that are happening before our eyes. They happen at the local, state, regional, and global systems. So when John was talking about earlier, this systems of systems construct that we're dealing with, this is literally playing out right before our eyes, and the levels of complexity that we have to address on a worldwide scale are critically important. So there has to be some type of thought process around these things to move our narrative forward. Next slide, please, John. So this is a causal loop diagram and an illustrative ethanol event of scenario with regarding fuel consumption dropping 75%. Our first problem is our gasoline demand has dropped significantly all over the world. As a result of that, the gasoline and the oil prices are ultimately impacted because of that. There is a byproduct of ethanol that now comes into this picture. The ethanol demand is decreased significantly as a result of that, which impacts the ethanol price. So now we have a gap between the ethanol supply and demand with regard to ethanol production. And the likely event of that occurring is now we have ethanol plant closures and capacity reductions as a result of that. Moving on, we have another node that we're dealing with. So our demand for allocation of corn to ethanol is impacted, as well as the allocation of corn to ethanol production. And now we have a gap between the demand and corn allocated for ethanol production, which becomes another cascading problem. As a result of that, corn production and corn ethanol production lead to corn used for ethanol would account for almost 38% share from production in 2017 or 2018. Now, the likely event from that, we have an issue, significant corn surpluses. Well, so now we come to a decision tree. Do we plant less now or export more? That becomes an important conversation for the C-suite folks in this equation to say, hey, what are we going to do? Are we going to export more to other parts of the world that need that corn, or are we going to plant less? Very important decisions that need to be made. As another result of the corn ethanol production, hand sanitizer and CO2 ultimately is impacted, and animal feed and other products that go into animal feed likely become a problem. So the other issue that we're dealing with here, with the CO2 production dropping close to 50%, we now have other indirect impacts with regard to food, to feed, to beer, to soda, the medical industry, and the industrial industries. So nobody could have predicted broadly that we would be having these issues. And nobody would have thought from the beginning of oil that we could have all of these indirect impacts in this holistic ecosystem with regard to fuel consumption. Next slide, please, John. We are now dealing with a multitude of different business strategies with regard to business continuity and continuity of operations. We have some bigger issues here that need to be addressed, and some of the strategic challenges that we are dealing with are rapid change, uncertainty, and time constraints. At the core of this problem is decision making. So all of these things come together as a complex system and a complex systems of systems because of the fact that we are addressing things and having to deal with them in ways that we had never thought possible. Complexity is not a friend of time and rapid change. And when you're dealing with complex, wicked, cascading problems, you're dealing with that uncertainty, which is ultimately leading to the decision-making processes that we have to address, not only to the left of boom, we also have, which is the preparedness and planning side, but we also have to address it to the right of boom, which is response and recovery. But during this decision-making process, we have to measure this through the boom as well, which is very, very important, because a bad decision on top of a cascading wicked problem can equal a bad day for everybody in the enterprise system. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Hand. I'm a biostatistician and data scientist. I've worked in the agri-food industry for over 20 years, with a number of years with the panelists that are on this webinar today. In the last 2 years, I've held the position of the Director of Data Research for the Food from Thought initiative at the University of Guelph. So there's this evolving concept of Society 5.0, which is an era defined by the increasing digitization and modernization of industry and societal infrastructures. Well, we all know this in agri-food, and we've discussed this for many years, that agri-food and our sector is a supporting pillar for Society 5.0. So we're going to be touching on all aspects of our smart future. We knew this pre-COVID, and it will become increasingly apparent during and after this crisis as we deal with issues around food security, for example, or food sovereignty. We would be misguided to overlook external pressures and cascading effects of externalities that were touched upon by CJ. But if we look within agri-food itself, when we talk about it, the workforce that's being affected or unhealthy, or facilities being shut down in slaughterhouses. And on the farm, that is very much amplified by an entire farm having to be shut down due to illness, or when we need and are reliant on temporary foreign workers to have a healthy growing season, which is going to be so important to feeding Canadians over this next year. Agri-food in and of itself is a complex ecosystem with farms and input providers, advisors, associations, not-for-profits, for-profit, industries, government, and research organizations. And there's competition at the local, regional, provincial, national, and global level. We have constant change in markets. We have constant changes that are due to climate change and other shocks that CJ mentioned in his slides. With this complexity, just within agri-food, we have internal cascading effects that affect all 5 pillars of our food system: food quality, safety, authenticity, defense, and security. And therefore, because of this multidimensional problem, we need a systems approach to address this complexity. The next slide, please. So COVID has exposed our vulnerabilities within agri-food, and our current business as usual is not working because we have not developed a systems approach to agri-food that would have provided the resiliency in our food ecosystem. We are not connected, and we're far too siloed. We don't even have a view of all the data and systems mapped within our ecosystem. We require a rapid insight so we can have a rapid response, and this requires a rapid access to data and clean data. We need to transform this into intelligence. It requires a secure and trusted mechanism for communication and collaboration. And this starts on the farm. Again, the farm is a complex ecosystem in and of itself. We often see the farm plopped on graphics as part of the ecosystem without truly understanding the challenges and the objectives at the farm level. So what we really need is leadership, and we need a framework wherein Canadian agri-food technology and industries can collaborate in order to realize mutual value and enable innovative business solutions and in the next generation of decision support capability. We can't take a buckshot approach right now. We really need, COVID has forced us, in fact, to rethink our business strategies. And it's driving acceleration in digital transformation in companies as they adapt to new realities. We need a national model that requires a targeted focus and a targeted objectives. We need standardized approaches to collaboration and communication across the ecosystem. We need to adopt interoperability standards such as GS1 that Kevin will touch on. We need an organization that can lead the governance principles and lay the foundation for the governance for now and for the future, and build solutions that will meet these challenges, but also allow us to recover and be more operational and take advantage of future opportunities to lead in the agri-food space. This institution or organization has to have deep ties and close connections to the ag industry with a deep understanding of the business operations, but with a vision across that ecosystem. Next slide. So we need to approach this very strategically, not only for the COVID, but for future. And we know that there is no direct line of sight to address these difficult issues of digitization. And those are like governance and trust, access, consent, IP, security. This was true before COVID, and now we have no choice but to do this. This is an opportunity. We need to seize this opportunity to address these challenges, to support recovery, but reimagine and re-architect our future food system. And we don't want to architect post-COVID. And with that, I will leave it to Kevin.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Dean. I'm a supply chain consultant based in Toronto. Next slide, please. You've been hearing a lot about complexity, and some of it is irreducible. The complexity of our trading relationships, the complexity of getting finished product to the store is something that we really can't engineer out of the system. But what we can do is find ways to reduce the complexity of sharing the information about what it is we're supplying. And that's where GS1 comes in. GS1 is probably the biggest standards organization that you've never heard of. GS1 is involved in supply chain standards. I myself consult for GS1 Canada, and I'm a member of the GS1 Architecture Group, which has technical oversight for the GS1 standards. And GS1's job is essentially threefold: to identify products, locations, shipping containers, documents, anything in the supply chain has a GS1, can have a GS1 identifier. The next layer is capture. You have this information. How do you capture it? How do you record it? Well, you start with barcodes. You start with RFID tags. The barcode in the store is the standard that, the GS1 standard that everyone is familiar with. GS1 manages the numbering system and defines or manages the barcode formats in which that information is presented. And then finally, share. What do you need to share, with whom, and for what purpose? As you've seen, the supply chain is complex, but you can reduce that complexity by sharing information about the products you supply, by entering into transactions with your trading partners in a standard format, and by recording the physical events that occur to your product as it moves through the supply chain, so that you can do traceability, so that you can manage recalls, so that you can promote consumer safety. Next slide, please. Standards are necessary. It's easy in a time of crisis to say that you don't have time to do the work necessary to identify your products correctly, to share data about them. You have to get them out the door. And to a certain extent, that's true. But the further down the supply chain your products go, the harder it is for your trading partners to deal with them. If they don't have consistent identification, if they don't have information about the products that they're handling, if they're not using standardized transactions, and if they're not able to record or to see traceability information so that they can assure their own downstream trading partners and their consumers that their products are safe. Ultimately, standards reduce costs. When everyone can agree on how to identify, capture, and share data, they can eliminate the costs associated with integrating disparate systems. Imagine having to deal with 3 different buyers in 3 different ways. Each of them sends you an order in a different fashion. Imagine, as a retailer, having to sell 1,000 products, none of which have any form of globally unique identification. Ultimately, standards reduce time to market. The time that you spend managing things differently from one trading partner to the next is time that you simply don't have. If you can tell all of your trading partners what you have, what its characteristics are, and how they can use it, you do that once, you've already reduced your time to market. And ultimately, standards improve safety. Without standards, in a chaotic supply chain, it's very easy for bad actors to insert their products without being detected. But when you've got consistent identification, consistent data sharing, consistent processes, it's harder to insert bad product into the supply chain, and it's easier to detect when it is. And ultimately, recalls and other consumer safety protocols are easier when everyone knows what has been recalled and by whom. Standards are about reducing complexity. They don't eliminate the complexity itself in terms of what the work that needs to be done to move product from one place to the next, but they do reduce the complexity in communicating what it is you need to do and how to do it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you all for those brief comments on such a complex topic. We'll now move to a panel type session, and I've just gonna rapid fire some questions at all of you, if you don't mind. Kevin, I'll start with you. Just since we finished with GS1, I think it's so interesting to see, like you said, the standards organization that nobody's ever heard of, but we've probably all seen and relied on. What type of data sharing options do GS1 standards support, and how do they help in this specific crisis?
There's essentially three types of data. There's master data. Master data is constant. It describes the product that you're selling. It describes the location that you're storing the product in. That kind of information is absolutely critical to trading partners. As a brand owner, as a retailer, I need to know what I'm buying. As a brand owner, I need to know the characteristics of the location in which my products are being stored, so that I can be assured that they're being stored properly. And GS1 has GDSN, the Global Data Synchronization Network, that allows trading partners to share product information in a many-to-many way to reduce the work required to inform your individual trading partners. The second layer is transactional data. What is it I want to do? What is it I am going to do? I want to order this product. I am shipping it to you. You're receiving it. I'm invoicing you, and you're paying it. There's no value to you as a retailer to have to order from 3 different suppliers in 3 different ways. So the transaction sets are standardized. When you as a retailer want to order from me, you're sending me the same kind of transaction set you send to everyone else. And the final layer is what I like to think of as the in-between layer. What happens in between the transactions? That's the event layer. That's the detailed traceability layer. What went into making this product? What happened to this product between the time it was manufactured and the time it was shipped? Where was it stored? What were the conditions? What were the conditions in the carrier? Was it properly refrigerated from point A to point B? How did the warehouse handle it? All of this information is possible using GS1 standards, and all of this information in the appropriate environment can be collated to give you a proper picture of the product as it makes its way from the manufacturer to the retailer to the consumer. All of these reduce costs, reduce friction, and improve consumer safety.
Thanks, Kevin, and I love that answer. As we've spoken in the past, it's really about that pre-competitive granularity of data again, and sharing global standards. And what you've said is that Canadians are really champions at using GS1 standards. So I think it's important.
Yeah, that's an important point that I forgot to mention. This is considered pre-competitive data. There is no value in competing on how I'm going to send you an order. Mm-hmm. The value is in how I'm going to handle your product, how I'm going to promote it, how I'm going to sell it to the consumer. So GS1 is all about the non-competitive attributes of the supply chain. Let's take the cost and the complexity down as much as we can and allow the trading partners in the supply chain to compete on what really matters, on the value of their products, on the service they can provide, on their response time, everything.
Yeah, and I like what you did to share your video screen while you're answering the question. I don't know if the other panelists, I know Karen, you might not be able to, but if the other panelists can, that would be great. Just a reminder to the participants as well to submit your questions, and we'll get to the questions. We have several coming in already. John, a question for you. The diagram you send up and the first slide sends shivers down everybody's spine, but it's one of those ones that really just does depict the complexity of the entire system. Are we missing vital skills and training sets across the industry right now to address this complexity? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Tyler, and I think that's a great question. If you look at how governments at multiple levels and how industry works within their organizations, it's very, very stovepiped. And you may have IT working on business continuity, you may have marketing working on something else, and you have production and R&D and innovation teams. But what needs to happen is that these organizations need to come together to look at the bigger ecosystem, which includes working with their trading partners. It includes governments at the federal level working with the provinces or the states in the US or with their key trading partners to look at the bigger picture. So from a skills and competencies perspective, systems thinking and this whole notion of cascading consequences, this is not there yet to the level that it should be. And Carl, our CJ, and I are both military trained, so we have a little bit of a bias here, and we've also been to business school. So what I think needs to occur, and I'd like to see the discussion around this, around the values and the value and benefits of introducing some forms of military training into business schools, where leaders will get trained on some key aspects of preparedness, managing during a crisis, and also looking at that big picture and the importance of leadership during a crisis, and then how to exit a crisis. So I'd like to see some more training or different types of training coming into business schools and also coming into organizations. And finally, I would say that it's not inconceivable that in 2021, we're going to see a government department or we'll see a company at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, once the staff get into their desks, to ring an alarm and say, pandemic planning, everyone go home and work at home for the next 5 days. And then during that 5 days, what they're doing is they're practicing. And this is what the military does very, very well, and the police and emergency services. They practice a lot. And what you do in practice is what you'll do in wartime. And I think that's an essential component of skills and competencies that need to be developed.
Yeah, wonderful answer, John. And again, we have spoken several times using that language of what to do during peacetime and wartime. And so I think it flows into the next question that I wanted to ask you too, is in peacetime, we operate differently. We compete, and that's just the way the capitalistic market works. But does it change during wartime or crisis? And what do leaders of companies need to prepare for? We see online that we have many leaders from at least 10 different countries today. Some are top execs from IT companies and from food companies. So they'll want to hear an answer and perhaps integrate you into their network in thinking about these kinds of things. So wartime versus peacetime, how do we behave differently?
Another great example, if I go back to the GS1 organization, so GS1 operates independently and neutrally in every country. But what they actually do is they protect the Competition Act. So they manage the antitrust by being able to get the retailers and the manufacturers and other parties around the table, protecting the consumer interests and maintaining the Competition Act so that there's no breaches of that. So within that context, the governance that GS1 provides in peacetime is also something that could be provided in a wartime crisis, because decisions that you make in a wartime crisis could force companies to actually work together. So companies that are fierce competitors need to become fierce collaborators for the greater good of the country or for humanity, whether it's broadly speaking and globally speaking. So these are the challenges that leaders have. So for example, we have factories that are closing down and 500 or 600 and 700 staff are impacted. Well, when you're bringing those factories back online, you may not have the staff, but you may have a competitor in another region, another province, another state, or even another country who has a critical skill set on particular machinery, and you may need to collaborate with your competitors to actually bring those people on board to get that task done. So thinking differently is very important. The other aspect is protecting IP. We know that we build a fortress around our companies. We protect our IP and our know-how. But as we know, if the US engages in the Defense Act or Canada and the Emergency Act or other countries, that companies may need to share their IP and their designs for building products. They may need to start sharing in different ways. There may be two competing food companies, and one of them may have an excess of inventory, but limited capacity, whereas their competitor has a lower level of inventory, but higher capacity. So if the critical need is to get a higher volume of product out to the market, it is conceivable that those two companies, those two leaders need to sit down and say, you know what, you produce 10 flavors of this product, I produce 8 flavors of the product. Why not reduce it to 2 flavors and do higher volumes, and let's figure out how we can collaborate. So I think we have to think differently on that, Tyler. And it's a new way of thinking. And I think business schools, again, can help us with managing that. And organizations like GS1 can not only help in peacetime, but also in wartime crisis by managing that antitrust component. Because the key thing is that decisions that we make during the crisis need to be returned to normal. And let me give you a specific example. So we have a run now on flour in Canada and in many countries, but the main brand of flour in Canada has actually run out of packaging. So they've run out of packaging and had to go out and get white packaging and brown packaging and then still convince the consumer that it's the same product. After the crisis, that has to return to normal. If you don't have an organization like GS1 that can help managing that, what will happen is after the crisis, you'll have the risk that they'll be claimed as counterfeit products or fake products and will be returned and cause other problems in the supply chain. So many things to consider, Tyler.
Excellent. And I was imagining myself drinking a Labud in the future. You know, you modestly say that these things could happen, and we have seen with pharmaceutical companies, for example, collaborating. And CJ, you talked about ethanol plants might be closing down. You are our American panelist, and we know that ethanol plants have closed down. CJ, I'm going to ask you about the importance of taking the multidimensional approach to addressing systems complexity, and if I can work into that question as well. The difference between system architecture and system complexity. So you got into that. I think it's a confusing and a challenging topic for a lot of people. If you can expand on that, let me know if you need me to repeat the question too.
Not a problem. So Tyler, you bring some very important points to bear here. So in John's background picture, you see a blue sky in Toronto. One of the very interesting things about that equation is the majority of these systems are designed for a quote unquote blue sky day. What that means is these systems ultimately are designed for normal operations. Well, we are dealing with anything but normal operations right now. And the bigger problem that we have to address is the systems thinking and the systems complexity. One of the things that we need to consider when we're doing all of these things is the systems complexity or the ethanol problems that we are looking at. We're talking about indirect impacts, secondary and tertiary effects, as well as the systems architecture versus the systems thinking. One of the bigger problems here is systems thinking. John's first slide kind of elicits the bigger picture in the systems thinking or the silos of that we discussed with regard to some of the problems that need to be addressed in these concentric circles, but they all end up being connected to each other holistically in some way, shape, or form. So looking at the systems architecture versus the systems thinking is also important, and being able to consider the things left of boom, right of boom, and through the boom are critically important as well. Because if we don't address these things, we're opening ourselves up to potential vulnerabilities and gap analysis. So as John had mentioned, we are talking about the military training that's critically important to understanding the if-then construct. If this occurs, then this, and this have the propensity to happen on other fronts. And the important thing here is I was just reading an article yesterday about, John was talking about flour in Canada. I was just reading that there was an old mill next to a river for grinding wheat that has been reactivated. It was a museum. It was over 1,000 years old, and it's still in production to supply local wheat to the local area. And that's just a testament to resilient systems architecture, because that mill has been there for 1,000 years. And the issue here is they took it from museum status to active duty status again. So basically a reserve component to active duty again, and they are now grinding flour as a result of that. So looking at all of these things is critically important, but the C-suite folks need to understand that there's a lot of systems complexity here, and there's a lot of cascading failures that can result from either uninformed decisions or bad decisions, and not understanding the systems architecture that's contained in some of these decision processes. So that's what I've got.
Yeah, excellent. And again, not a you can't have a simple answer to a complex question. I'm going to interrupt the panel for a sec to take some of the questions from online, just because they're very good, and I don't want you to think that they're being ignored. As we go through this issue, we've all seen different decisions by different countries, whether or not to block or limit exports, for example. And we might think that countries and or governments are starting to have the silly behavior of hoarding as well. And you think about that as Canada's role as a global citizen. What are we supposed to do? And I think maybe, John, I'll start with you. Karen, I'll get back to specific questions with you in a little bit. But John, one of the participants has asked, what is the specific role for government and what levels of government? What should they do about addressing these kinds of issues? Anybody else can answer that as well. I'll start with John.
Yeah, that's a superb question. As I mentioned in the big complex slide that I showed earlier, of course, the government at the federal level has a governance role. And when you get down into the provinces or the states or into countries, depending on the structure, government plays a critical role at different levels, whether it's enforcement at the local level within a city or up at the provincial level to enable inter-provincial or interstate trade. So government play a critical role, but if we take the role right now of global citizenship, that one is very, very important, because Canada plays a fantastic role, as does the US, in global citizenship, making sure that less developed countries or economies have access to food. Because we know from the 2008 crisis, when food was blocked, wheat exports were blocked, I think it was Russia and Ukraine, that actually caused a lot of social unrest. And that social unrest that came out of that food insecurity, prices went up at the same time, and the social unrest created riots in about 48 different countries. So it's quite significant. Access to food, availability of food, and pricing of food is very, very sensitive. So the Canadian government at the federal level, in working with their counterparts around the world to make sure that food can flow, especially to the lesser developed countries, is important. But you mentioned something at the start, Tyler, that I think is critical that we examine a little bit more in dialogue, and that's where governments have started to block exports of foods. Now, if you look at the broad global food system, about 1% of the global food system is impacted by protectionist moves. But we can be very negative and look at it as protectionist moves, but we can also look at the other side of this. When large companies and countries, governments, actually start hoarding themselves, they do panic buying and hoarding. So I think that when India said no more exports of rice, when Vietnam said no more exports of rice, they're the number one and the number three exporters of rice. When they blocked the exports of rice, I think that's actually a good thing. And here's why I think it's a good thing. Because industry or brokers and governments may try that panic buying and hoarding and then try to resell it to other places. But when Vietnam, for example, they blocked everything, then they said, you know what, we're going to move to a quota system. And that quota system is based on current contracts, not new contracts. So I think that's a very, very important thing that we need to mine into. And governments like Canada needs to look at that as well, adhering to current contracts, looking at if there's a risk, of course, to overall food security, moving into a quota system and making sure that everybody else is behaving adequately in the global ecosystem. We don't want social unrest as a result of food security issues. And when we get back into Canada at the different levels, it's vitally important that the federal government, let's say if I use Canada or use the US or any other country, that they enable that ecosystem to grow. Farmers need to be able to connect out to their markets. We have not digitized to the extent where we know where our food is today and how much food we have. So the global problem we have today is not one of food security, it's one of food uncertainty. And I want to emphasize that point. It's food uncertainty rather than food security. And we can eliminate and reduce that food uncertainty if we digitize appropriately and putting in technologies that can help us. Again, I'm not going to mention a specific technology because there's so many out there that can help us. But think of the federal government's role, the provincial government's role, the state's role in the US, for example. If we put in technologies, they can help us to build in these circuit breakers where we can identify if something is going out of tolerance and act accordingly. I think that's very important.
John, I think that's great, and what a great answer. I'll move on to a different question, but really what you've highlighted for me, security and uncertainty, I think the government's role is for Canada to continue to act ethically, to make sure that we keep our supply chain open and our exports open. We still want veggies from the Salinas Valley and coffee from around the world, for example, and we don't want those things to turn off. I'll get back to another question in a little bit around the future of affordability, I suppose, after this.
Tyler, if I may, just before you do.
Oh, please.
One quick point to make is that the supply chain is so interconnected that any government or any entity that attempts to impose any kind of restrictions on the flow of goods runs the risk of having the same done to them, often for the same goods. The example recently was the attempt by the U.S. government to restrict the movement of N95 masks manufactured by 3M that were bound for Canada. But the fact is, those masks are made with a special pulp that is available only from a mill in British Columbia. And so when you move to restrict the export of goods, you can, if you don't fully understand the supply chain behind those goods, you can end up with retaliatory action that ultimately does more harm than good.
And Tyler, if I could dovetail on Kevin's comment, the unintended consequences of those actions were just highlighted there. So for the C-suite folks, looking at those decisions and the unintended consequences of those actions not only can cause retaliatory action, but they can also cause disruptions in the systems, of systems that we're talking about here. So we have some issues that need to be dealt with, but understanding the complexity of the problem and the potential unintended consequences of cascading failures is also critically important as well.
Perfect, and I'm glad you both jumped in because again, within an hour, we can't deal with the complexity of this discussion today, obviously, and so thank you for that. It's a very important question. One more from the floor, and then we'll get back to some of the ones that I had prepared for Karen, and maybe Karen or CJ would be most appropriate to answer this one. Is it possible to create subsystems that can be self-contained and serve a subset of consumers? So a specific subset, and he's thinking, for example, the consumer-supported agriculture, the CSA type programs. Anybody want to take that one away? I'm not sure where to direct it, but CJ or Karen, and if not, others.
I could certainly take that one if no one else can jump in.
Well, go ahead, Kevin, and I'll have a comment after you.
Sure. The challenge is that the supply chain itself is highly complex, and creating a self-contained subsystem essentially means that you have to wall yourself off from the rest of the supply chain. So it's a very difficult thing to do, and in the work I've done at GS1, I've seen a number of companies try to do this in trying to position themselves as the solution for a specific industry or for a specific function. And ultimately it never works because they end up having to interact with the traditional supply chain, with the existing supply chain in some fashion. And the self-containment ultimately goes out the window.
So I would say that part of what we need to think about, and I'll use farm data as an example, and it was a good question, Tyler. So yes, we do need systems or architectures that we can build that will address certain and specific parts of our supply chain, but enable them to engage collaboratively and interoperable standards such as GS1 across the supply chain. One of the problems that I see right now is when we talk about GS1, we haven't spent the time to bring GS1 right back to the farm. So what is the master data at the farm level? And we've often talked about that as the demographic data. What are the transactional data that we could capture and classify using GS1 that will help primary ag from a farm perspective. And then again, what is it that we can use with the in-between data that can help leverage those data assets for our farmers in terms of the data that they own and how the data is now being used, and often to their detriment or not where they benefit. So in this scenario, I see that we can implement, we talk about, you and I have often worked hard on creating AgBox, this idea of a data cooperative for farmers, an interaction point into the ecosystem to allow all this interoperability that's trusted and run by the organizations that they trust. And these associations can look at and map out how does GS1 apply to their system. They have the tacit knowledge that could help us classify those systems. And then moving forward, even looking at self-sovereign identity type systems where, for example, we have Grain Farmers of Ontario that could give a digital stamp of certification for any of the credence claims. For one example might be organic. Farmers no longer have to provide all their data to numerous systems. They have a certificate. It could be at a level at, I've used this type of product to, or input on my farm, to even a credence such as halal or organic. So we need a systems thinking. We need an institution that has that vision to move us forward using a variety of technologies, an entire technology stack, and specifically targeting challenges that are choke points currently in our agri-food ecosystem.
Wonderful.
Tyler, if I may, Karen also brings up a very interesting point with regard to tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge within the industry is critically important as well, because we have a lot of other folks who are considering the fact that you have a human in the loop for a lot of these integrated systems. Those people are responsible for the operation of systems. So when you're talking about seasonal workers or people going to farms, and for our C-suite folks on the call, looking at that tacit knowledge, replacing somebody in a slaughterhouse or on a farm is not something you just put a warm body in for. The bigger problem here is that those people have tacit level knowledge of the systems architecture or the enterprise system that they are addressing, and they know it better than anybody. Throwing a warm body in there may not be the solution. And to Kevin's other point of those silos, this is literally a holistic system, and everything is literally connected to everything in some way, shape, or form. So being able to understand those things and how that system behaves under normal circumstances versus interrupted or disrupted circumstances such as these are also very important things to consider as well in the broader construct of systems thinking.
Yeah, very good. We're approaching 10, so I want to make one comment to the audience before people need to drop off. And if you do want to stay on, we'll continue the discussion. I think the five of us love talking together, so we'll stay on for each other if that's it. But there's still a significant number on. My request to the participants, to the audience, is that you include some of the folks in this panel in your networks and introduce them through relevant channels who are struggling or tackling these very complex system related problems. Similarly, if you'd like to send feedback about the panel or the webinar today and what we should be thinking about, then by all means, please do. John's just brought up the screen for his email. He can share contact information from the panelists as well. So getting back into the Q&A here so we don't lose any time, Karen, you talked about creating a collaborative system, a data co-op or whatever form of open access, and that doesn't mean open data. We've talked about this, but just that flexibility, that speed of access to good, clean, authenticated data. Who should build and administrate such a system, and how do you govern such a system?
Yeah, very, very good question, Tyler. We've talked about this for many years, and with the broader ecosystem and with farmers. We really need an institution, a not-for-profit, to boldly go where no one has gone before, basically, and we need to do it now. It needs to be a not-for-profit that is non-competitive, that works in that non-competitive space, like GS1, that is technology agnostic, that has a broad vision of the systems and knows where the tacit knowledge exists. So where to tap into the tacit knowledge, where the choke points are. We need to map our systems, map our data, and then try very rapidly, fail fast at addressing COVID challenges with the vision of moving towards a better system for the future so that we don't have to re-architect that. And in terms of governance, one of the key things in terms of governance is that these legacy systems of like the DGI digital governance framework aren't going to work in these complex systems, nor IP approaches that have been typically used. So in smart cities and agri-food, we need to look at this, and the real question is how to realize an implementable governance framework designed by those who create, share, and consume that data. And it's not an easy task, but we have the expertise in Canada to do this.
John, your screen is on. Did you have something that you wanted to add to this, or?
No, I'll wait for you to ask the GS1 questions. Maybe Kevin can start with that.
Sure. So a question on the floor again is, how does GS1 deal with the tendency of operators to pick and choose certain information that fall into the realm of voluntary disclosures, where such information is outside of the usual scope of traceable data? Kevin.
It's important to note that GS1 doesn't have any kind of enforcement mechanism. GS1 is a voluntary standards organization. People or organizations participate because they see value in improving the standards that they have to work with. Ultimately, enforcement comes from two directions in standards. One is compliance with your with your trading partners. If your trading partners require you to provide this information, and they simply won't do business with you if you don't provide it, then you can voluntarily withhold it, but you simply won't be doing business with that trading partner. The second channel is through regulation. The regulators themselves, if they often work with GS1 and with parties in the supply chain to find the best way to achieve the outcomes they desire. And the regulators can update the regulations to require that information. But ultimately, anything that is voluntary is voluntary, and it's up to you to decide whether or not you will provide it, and it's up to your trading partners to decide whether or not they will continue to do business with you if you don't.
Yeah, I'll build on that, Tyler. Excuse me. So my deep research area is in transparency and trust in the food chain, and specifically around how and why do companies disclose information. So as Kevin pointed out, the voluntary information will and can be shared. One of the nuances here is that the information that's shared has to be information that's requested. So if we look at studies that have come out of the US, for example, and around the world, we see a disparity between what consumers on the West Coast will want versus consumers on the East Coast. And we don't want to be just pushing information out voluntarily. I spoke with a CEO in Shanghai who has an online food platform. And because trust in China, in food in particular, is very low, they decided to do something what they call radical transparency. Now, I don't like that term because I don't think we can do simple transparency yet. But they use what they call radical transparency, and they provided the consumers, which are the moms primarily, with 16 or 18 pages in a PDF of all of the analytical science tests that were actually done on the product. Now, the feedback from the consumer was counter what they expected. The consumer said, we didn't ask for it, we don't need it, and you scared us, to be honest. So that was a lesson learned for that company. They were pushing information out voluntarily that actually wasn't necessary. We know also that companies could push out information about how they slaughter animals, but we know that consumer groups, especially different demographic groups, They don't want to know that an animal lived and died, and they don't want to know that it went through a slaughterhouse. They want to eat the steak and enjoy the steak and not know about the conditions in the supply chain. So we have NGOs, on the other hand, who want to force that information out of the market. We have industry who are trying to be sensitive to consumers' needs by giving the consumer and the different demographics the information that they request. And I think that's all very important information. The other nuance here is that a desire to know something does not give you the right to know. And that's a very important point. So on one hand, the government regulation, I should say, will demand secrecy within a company. And think of non-disclosure of financial information before the end of a fiscal period. So the government will say, you know what, we have regulatory frameworks in place that you cannot share that information before you disclose it. But on the other hand, government wants industry to be forthcoming with transparent information to ensure that consumers can trust that information. So on the government side, enforcement side, they can do follow-up. We know that marketeers can create noise and distortion in information as it goes to market. I'll give you some silly examples: gluten-free water or gluten-free tomatoes. So we have some stuff, noise or distortion in the system that can really cause people to question, why is this information being disclosed? Why now? And is it actually accurate? So I think the regulatory bodies in most of the countries that are developed, and even in the lesser developed countries, they're focusing a lot more on claims that companies can make and making sure that the language used in those claims is accurate and there's science-based evidence behind it, which also helps to inform policy, of course.
I love those examples. Thanks, John. And in the dairy system, we've always said we could tell you if your milk came from a blue-eyed cow, but who's going to pay for that data? You know, it does cost money to do. And having said that, when you see globally respected and trusted standards organizations like GS1, and to Karen's point, you don't need the granularity of data. You need a tick box from something that is trusted, that you have been audited and authenticated. I want to move on. There's still a significant number of participants. I want to move on to a panel question of how do nations and companies return to normal after this crisis? I think we're all thinking about what do we do now? Is there a risk of food fraud on the rise based on the conversation we've had, for example? So if everybody wants to come on board and say, what is your thought on how we return to normal, both as a country or as a company?
I can kick off the discussion on that. I like a paper that came out by McKinsey recently, and they talk about 6 R's and 5 R's, and I would add another one to that. And they talk about resolve the issues first, resolve the current issues that you have at the national level, at the international level, and that's crisis management. But then you need to build resilience. As you're doing that, you need to build resilience into the system. That's the second R. Resilience is, can we survive? Can you get enough cash flow out of these companies so that they can survive? But resilience is also that when you do return to a new normal, that you can protect your industry, your companies from predatory acquisitions, which may happen later. And several governments around the world have announced that they will protect their industry from potential predatory actions after the crisis. We know that companies will fail. We know that certain sectors are under significant pressure. And when you do return, we're not going to return to normal as we know. We're going to return to a new normal. So, there's a German philosopher and Hegel, and Hegel says, we learn from history that we don't learn from history. So this is a chance for us to do the 4th R, which is to reimagine the future. We now have a good chance, as somebody often says, don't waste a good crisis, to reimagine what that future could be. Digitization is a critical component of that. And then we need to reform. So as we reimagine, then we get into the 5th one that McKinsey talks about, reform. And it's reforming our policies and our practices, not only at the regulatory level or policy level, but also in trade and also in practice within industry. And the 6th one that I would add to that is re-educate. We need to re-educate right from the ground up. And I'm talking about the STEM education, science, technology, and so on. We need to teach children before they get to 10 or 12 years old, and I believe this has been proven out in the US, if you catch children early enough and educate them about food and about good hygiene and good practices, that will stick with them for the rest of their life. You know, talking about things like nutrition. And I think we can build better, safer, and more healthy communities moving forward. I would say that one of the dilemmas we have when we're in a crisis, we have to focus on speed over precision. But as we reimagine the future, we have to flip that on its head and look at precision over speed.
John, I'm going to jump in because I'm not the only one who missed an R. So the first R was resolve the issues. That's for the chat. The second was resilience. I missed the third R. And then
the third one is returning to a new normal.
Okay.
The fourth one is reimagining the future.
Yeah.
The fifth is reform. The sixth, the one that I've added, is re-educate.
Perfect. And as you're making these comments too, and I think the re-educate component addresses this, is there will be new job opportunities as well that come out of this. So feel free to include that in your comments. Carl or Kevin, go ahead. Kevin, yeah. Carl, Karen.
Yeah, another thing to add to John's statement that we won't be returning to normal, we'll be going to a new normal, is the way that the supply chain is going to have to react. Companies are going to be looking at risk mitigation strategies to deal with events like this, and they'll do that in a couple of ways, in several ways, but two of the most important will be, one is looking at near sourcing some of their supplies, some of their critical supplies, to ensure that in the event that there is a similar crisis or another crisis in the future, that they still have access to the raw ingredients or components that they need to continue business. But the second that I think is going to be even more interesting is that they're going to be asking their trading partners, their suppliers, what plans they have to deal with a situation like this. In what we used to know of as normal times, it was very easy to be complacent, to say that I'm just looking for a supply of the following product with these characteristics, and I'll go with whoever gives me the best price. But that's not going to be enough anymore. It's not just going to be, can you supply me with this product, but can you supply me with this product in a crisis?
And to Kevin's point, that crisis thinking and understanding the things that support your enterprise systems are critically important as well. So understanding that the underlying infrastructure supports the things that we do 24/7, 365, and when those things aren't there anymore, it's time to start rethinking how resilient your system's architecture is, or how resilient your system's thinking is in some of these equations, because a lot of these processes may have not been thought through with regard to from farm to table and all the interconnects in between. So there's a lot of complexity in that equation, and being able to understand those things is also critically important, because if we don't look at the broader picture, we could be missing opportunities to create resiliency within our enterprise systems, as well as looking at some of the other things, the existential factors that could potentially disrupt our systems by doing gap analysis, by doing tabletop exercises, by understanding that these are not trivial problems and they need to be addressed as such.
And I'd like to add and finish on the note that I agree with Kevin and CJ and John, and they pointed out just great examples on how we can do this throughout the supply chain. In specifically to agri-food, the government right now is doing a wonderful job at investing in innovations when we talk about vaccines and treatments and technologies to help us on the health side. But this idea of putting out calls for proposal for innovation in agri-food, although very important, I don't see that as being very targeted. I see it as this kind of buckshot type of approach. And if we talk about trying to decrease the complexity through systems thinking, we do need a focused leadership with this vision of a systems approach and how to lead a strategy for agri-food, and looking at the different technologies and challenges and mapping them and understanding them deeply. So I don't know, and I don't believe that that is the role of the government. So we need to appoint leaders specifically for that task, and to ensure that any money going into innovation or investments is going to help us now and again, from a systems approach, recover and move into the future for resilience, re-education, and reform.
And Tyler, I'd build on that again with just another example of something we need to be cognizant of. So we know that worldwide passenger travel is down internationally, I think by about 95%. Domestic travel is down by over 70%, US and Canada being the two primary markets. We're learning from China as they flatten the curve and they decrease the amount of infections with COVID-19. You can see that the economy is starting to come up and flights are starting to increase. So it is the correlation between the two. However, consumer confidence is not there yet. So the consumers are not taking their flights. Flights will start for business purposes, but flights for pleasure is going to take a long time. So what IATA, the association based in Montreal, they monitor the airlines and they're saying that consumer confidence to fly is probably 6+ months out. And the secondary part behind that, we know that, or we can imply from what we know with how we move food around the world, I believe about 80% of our food sits in the bellies of passenger aircraft. So when we reduce or significantly reduce the amount of passenger flights worldwide, we take away that sort of subsidy. And so what has happened over the last couple of weeks is that freight costs per kilo has actually doubled. And this is a significant impact. Now we have to look at how do we return to normal within countries like Canada and the US? Well, United, Delta, EasyJet in Europe, and Ryanair, they're now being confronted with what's called outside of Canada social distancing, but what we prefer to call here physical distancing, which sends a better signal to society. We're now confronted with the possibility where the middle seat will have to go. And if the middle seat goes in aircraft, that means that the possibility of the cost of those flights will increase by up to 50%, if not more. So we have significant looming challenges as we try to return to normal even for business travel. So the cost of everything will be significant. We need to be able to think these things through and figure out what is the impact on the food chain. And even when we get down into things, Tyler, like doing audits on factories around the world, we're not flying, companies are not flying, regulators are not sending their inspectors abroad. Companies are not sending their inspectors abroad. So the alternative to that is to do remote inspection using digital tools. Well, the current frameworks that we have, the current schemes, there are 12 schemes within what's called the GFSI program. And those 12 schemes have agreed not to do digital remote auditing, which is kind of bizarre. ISO standards do permit remote auditing, and ISO standards help to inform policy. So we're going to have a looming challenge coming down the path, especially as this crisis, if it takes longer, we need to rethink the decisions that organizations like GFSI have made not to permit remote auditing as a complementary feature. I think, to be honest, any form of auditing is better than no auditing to reduce the risk of food safety issues and other possible contaminations.
Yeah, sure. And just such a web of issues that you bring up here, John. And I think, again, that authenticity. Are we worried about jobs by doing remote auditing, or are we worried about authenticity of the audit? And as Karen and all of you have brought up, really good, trusted digital infrastructure, if you will, data interoperability and authenticated data will make a difference. One thing to get in here, and John, I'd like to pitch something to you, just saying you've been gracious in organizing this webinar, and if I've missed anything, then by all means jump in. But we've seen through this panel, and we still have more than half the participants online, so that's why I'm just keeping on going here. But we've seen through the panel that there are conceptual models, there is in-depth thinking that has gone on here. That exists, but are there companies that are doing this today? Is there somebody that GS1 is an obvious example of a standards organization. I don't want to call it a company unless it is, Kevin, but who else is out there that you might want to mention? And this is not a plug to anything in particular, but so you can be conceptual if you'd like.
Well, we do have initiatives that are going on in Canada, like the ones that are coming out of Guelph. You have the IRL Institute working on initiatives. McGill University is working on initiatives in Canada. Karen and I are involved in some. There's the concept that you're involved in with AgBox, which is looking at the data collected on the farm and how do you make sense of that data. And I think all of that is important. GS1 plays an important role. While they're not a solution provider, they are a service enabler. And in that context of being a service enabler, they can help these organizations who do set up different capabilities and competencies or portals to support a particular segment of the industry. Let's say it's a particular commodity. They can help them make sense of the data and then share that data so it's more meaningful in the broader ecosystem. So I think those things are being done. We have an entrepreneur here in Toronto, a software company in Toronto, that's taken an incredible approach. I won't mention the company name, but what they've done is they can facilitate a company to map all of their factories around the world, their suppliers around the world, and through real-time data, they can overlay on top of that the COVID-19 outbreaks. So immediately you have a picture of the supply chain. So you're doing supply chain mapping on the one hand, which is critically important. Then you're overlaying the crisis on top of that. And then you can start overlaying other issues on top of that where you're using open data. It could be climate data. It could be alert data coming in from the WHO or somewhere else. It could be data on food fraud. It could be data on that you layer on top of your supply chain, which talks about climate problems in one country or a drought. And if they're a particular supplier of a commodity, you can start to increase the risk. So the risk of fraud entering your supply chain as a result of drought. And some companies are actually doing this today. So the more we can map our supply chains, the more we can make sense of the data, and the more we can apply some of the techniques, let's just call it the family of AI techniques, we can create these triggers and alerts and create these circuit breakers that help us to turn on or turn off something very quickly.
It may be a good chance to request any closing remarks, any questions that I didn't ask you. Let's start with our last speaker, Kevin, and go backwards. So we'll finish with John. So we'll go Kevin, Karen, CJ, and then John. I think this might be a good time to have our last comments, and then we could close if that's John's wish.
Certainly. As I mentioned in my presentation, we can't engineer all the complexity out of the supply chain, but we can. But by sharing information, by working together, we can reduce that complexity and make the supply chain safer. To the earlier question about the nature of GS1, GS1 is a not-for-profit organization. Their mandate is to work with industry to develop collaborative standards, all purely voluntary, and they're international in nature. And every one of the organizations around the world operates under the same not-for-profit collaborative model.
And I would like to add that I think we need to challenge all the participants today that were within the webinar and listening to use your influence and your networks to enable a systems approach in agri-food and to go forth boldly, as I would say, so that we have interoperability, we have a systems approach in agri-food with authenticated data, using the tacit knowledge and expertise that we have in agri-food, and ensuring that we're all moving in step towards a vision that will address the issues of today, but also in recovery and for the future.
I would add to Karen's thoughts as well. The other thing that we need to consider here are some of those small things within the systems architecture, i.e. the tripwires or the plugs in the system, as far as widening the gap a little bit in the systems architecture, because most of these systems are either just in time or so tightly coupled that when they start cascading out of control. If we create a little bit of a buffer zone within those things, we will ultimately have some things that will assist us in the whole system not failing. Those are important things. We need to consider them. And for the folks who have been on this call, I would challenge them to think about this problem differently, for the simple fact that those circuit breakers that we're talking about could potentially be widening the gap a little bit, not only in your just-in-time architectures, but looking at how the system is architected and how some of those gaps may end up saving your business instead of hurting those efficiencies that we all speak of in the broader context of things.
I would, just before I finish, I'll address the question from John Duffield. John is in Vietnam. John mentioned the alternative is also to use in-country people. And what John is referring to is the remote auditing. And John is absolutely right that the companies responsible for auditing and the brand owners need to tap out and develop their networks within countries as an alternative. And you have people like John Duffield, who's an agronomist in Vietnam and well trained to be able to execute inspections in Vietnam. Tyler, before we finish, I would say that there's a couple of words we used. I don't want to say they're buzzwords, but if it helps people to get the message across internally in their organizations, then they could be useful. I think systems thinking, just to think of my very first slide that everyone will get access to, think of that. And think of systems of systems. The second thing I would say is think of cascading consequences. If something happens over here on the left, can it impact something else further down the supply chain? What are the impact of policy on practice, and so on? And the other things, two little buzzwords to remember. Think of technology's ability to put in tripwires and circuit breakers. And I think using those two terms of tripwires and circuit breakers, they will help us. The tripwire is the early warning, it's the alerts that we need, and the circuit breakers is to intervene and to stop something that's occurring. We have that notion in the stock market today, but we don't have it in our food systems. And we don't have it in our food systems because we don't have the data. We haven't been able to architect it. The third component I would say is think of the control tower, like at an airport. We need a control tower at the federal level in Canada and the US and other places to look at the macroeconomic issues of the food supply, what's coming in, what's being processed, and what's going out. So I know they sound buzzwordy, but they help to simplify the message. And this is what I'm all about and the team is all about. How do we simplify the message? And how do we not only take action, but get results? And we have to get the balance between our actions and the results that we want to achieve. Finally, I just want to say before I pass over to you, Tyler, thank you very much for facilitating this session today. You did a fantastic job. And thank you to our fellow panelists for making time. We originally didn't plan to go over, but as Tyler allowed the flexibility, and thanks to the speakers for staying on as well to address the questions. So thank you for that, Tyler, and back over to you to close.
Yeah, agreed. And we went on because we still had a third plus of the viewers who are in this. This is not an easy topic to cover in an hour and a half, or even probably a year, but we'll be working for some time to reform systems. And I think that was quite evident from the skill and the quality of the people in this session. So please reach out to John if you'd like access to any of the panelists, their contact information. I think there's such deep thinking that's going on here around the world, but certainly within the panel that we had today. And it's really important to capture some of these great ideas and this collaborative, symbiotic relationships that are being created here. So John, thank you for letting me participate. What a pleasure it is. I love these conversations and just to listen and learn so much. And I probably need to watch this session a couple of times myself to get the depth. And maybe you'll have some questions about sharing those slides that you had there too. I'm not sure. There's a lot of information in them and it's quite brilliant. So thank you to all the participants who stayed on and those who had to drop off. I'm sorry we didn't get to say goodbye to you sooner. Keep up the good work. This is far from over, and we have to think of post-COVID a lot more aggressively now. and best of luck to everybody. I hope you're healthy and well. Take care.